The naval exercises are as much for symbolism and for show as they are for any real military
Yep.
purpose. And then that is that massive embarrassment which came out Monday, because Putin had actually Sunday, Putin had actually gotten into St. Petersburg.
Yep.
He was there. There's footage of him in St. Petersburg. He's supposed to show up in Navy Day, and then they scrubbed the exercise. Why did they scrub the exercise? Because Ukraine had hit a couple of key targets overnight, a couple of key plants that support the Russian military, and they closed the airport in one of the key Russian cities that's several hundred kilometers from the border. But then they closed the airport in St. Petersburg as well.
Yep.
And at that point, if you're closing the airport in St. Petersburg, are you really going to proceed with this Navy Day parade? So it's an embarrassment for them, to say the least. Oh, I think it's not just Russians are skittish. I think the Kremlin is skittish. I mean, I think if you look at the statements, and it's always a case of decoding. If you decode Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, and that could be a task, because I mean, that guy, basically every other word is a piece of jargon, right? But if you can finally cut out about 75% of that and get to the core of what he says, is he on the one hand is restating the demands, and he did that yesterday, which is, okay, we're only really going to negotiate with Ukraine once we've achieved our immediate aims, which means expanding occupation of Ukrainian territory. And then what he says is effectively, all right, but then we will consider getting back around the table. They are feeling the pressure on that. Economically, that stock market reaction is a combination of things, I suspect, Philip. I suspect it is Trump's announcement coming in, but it's also the fact that the Russians are caught now with that wartime economy between running it on overdrive, which drives up inflation, or trying to curb the inflation and risking sending the economy into a recession. So the big development within Russia in the past 72 hours has been that the interest rate has been cut from 20% to 18%.
Yeah.
Now, that might be a little bit of like an arcane fact for many folks, but it's the second rate cut the central bank has done. And it has been because the central bank is under pressure from the economy ministry, which is saying our economy is slowing down. All that drive, that impetus we got from the military spending, that only can go so far. You've got to do more to stimulate the economy. Central bank has been holding out against that because it raises the risk of inflation. But now they're having to give ground. What you're seeing is an economy which in the short term was maintaining itself by just simply funding the war.
Yep.
But at some point it reaches a crunch point. And you and I have discussed this before. The question, and this does not mean, by the way, collapse of Russia. That tired narrative. But when they reach that crunch point, which is both running a domestic economy and maintaining the military effort, then that becomes key. And Trump just adds that little bit of, maybe this time he's serious. Because, let's emphasize this, Philip, it's not sanctions on Russia. Sanctions on Russia have gone pretty far. What the U.S. could do, by the way, and keep your eye out for this if they're serious about this, is the EU has lowered the cap on Russian oil from $60 per barrel to $45. That was in the package last week. The Americans have not done that yet. Now, if the Americans are serious, they can put that sanction on Russian oil. But beyond that, of course, when you hit China and India, you're trying to detach them from the Russian economy, not just the Russian military effort, the Russian economy. Would the Trump administration risk doing that with China at a time when it's negotiating with China over tariffs? That's a big question. Will they risk upsetting the Indians further? Because the Indians are not happy with the Trump folks because they thought they were going to get a trade deal a few months ago, and Trump walked away from it and hit them with a 26% tariff. So, if the U.S. is serious, it's that effect on China and India that you're watching for. But again, that's not a done deal.
Yeah. But then, if we look at some of the other indicators that are around, we've had the first reports of wholly supplied Chinese UAVs being found used by the Russians and therefore that plays into Donald Trump's anti-China bit. We're seeing increased Chinese aggression around the Philippines, and actions around the different island stock that are there. Maybe Trump might do something to jump in and give India a trade deal at the last minute to try and split India and China a little bit more. And then indicators inside Russia. We've got Russia has launched one of its largest naval exercises for a long time, with 150 ships through different fleets around the sea. But it finished over the weekend when there was supposed to be a big Navy Day parade, which happens on an annual basis, for veterans of the Russian Navy, and Putin cancelled that for security reasons. More likely unreliability reasons, and he didn't want to be embarrassed at not being able to put the numbers of ships that he'd normally expect there. Do you think there are little indicators to suggest that Putin can't afford to continue the war, but he has to continue the war because he can't afford not to?
I think, what we do is we look at certain events and we say, not does this mean yes or no, he can or can't continue the war, but what could be the effects on the constraints. So let's take three different things that you've laid out very well here. First of all, that question of whether there will be a stronger U.S. push against China to try to separate them from Russia. Now, the Biden administration tried to do that, and the Biden administration was pretty coherent. I don't necessarily agree with every step they took. I think they could have been harder on China. They were coherent. The problem with the Trump administration up to now is they've been incoherent on China so far. But you're going to know what's happening here. The reason why we're getting more news coming out about what the Chinese are supplying to the Russians is in part because people in certain agencies are now willing to leak that. Yeah. And that includes European agencies, Ukrainian agencies, and maybe even with American agencies, precisely so Trump sees this, right? They're trying to change the narrative on China. And they're trying, because that means even if the sanctions don't come immediately on China, the Chinese may start to think, we need to put some pressure on these companies. We're overexposed here. India is really interesting. I wish you were in Washington, Philip. We could use you there, man, because that is absolutely the play to make on India. It's the play to make on India, by the way, because of an event in a different arena, which is the Indians, because of Trump's chaos. What did they do? They in the UK accelerated their talks, and they got a historic trade deal a few days ago, right? So if the Americans are actually thinking sensibly economically, they want to get back in with India. But of course, it also has that added effect, which is you separate them from the Russians. Yeah. Now, that's the economic front. Then you have the front of what's happening inside Russia, which is not just the economic aspect, it's the security aspect. Again, Russia, the naval exercises are as much for symbolism and for show as they are for any real military purpose. And then that is that massive embarrassment which came out Monday, because Putin had actually Sunday, Putin had actually gotten into St. Petersburg. He was there. There's footage of him in St. Petersburg. He's supposed to show up in Navy Day, and then they scrubbed the exercise. Why did they scrub the exercise? Because Ukraine had hit a couple of key targets overnight, a couple of key plants that support the Russian military, and they closed the airport in one of the key Russian cities that's several hundred kilometers from the border, but then they closed the airport in St. Petersburg as well. And at that point, if you're closing the airport in St. Petersburg, are you really going to proceed with this Navy Day parade? So it's an embarrassment for them, to say the least. But that's not the end of the story. As we speak, they may have recovered from it now, but overnight there was a serious hacking attack on Aeroflot, which is the Russian state airline. Now, people out there will probably know the stories about how the airports periodically have to be shut, especially in the Moscow area because of the drone attacks. Now they had to shut down one of Moscow's key airports for some time and had to cancel more than 50 flights because the IT system was vulnerable. And that again is what you and I have discussed, which is this is a war on multiple fronts. And as much as I appreciate we take a hook like Trump's headline statement, the challenge of covering this war, but the necessary challenge of covering this war is to really evaluate then how action is taken on multiple fronts that intersect with each other. And I have to say, if we want a takeaway for this, I'm never optimistic about this. Nobody can be optimistic about this. But I'd say in the past couple of weeks, I think Ukraine's in a better space now with the Europeans, with the Americans, and therefore in a better space regarding this war on multiple fronts because of a series of developments. And that's despite the fact they're still under pressure on the front line, especially in Donetsk.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.